What we thought we'd do is just start with a few words from each of us about the issues, the political background and such like, and then go on to cover some subjects and some of the more contentious issues which are now ahead of us in the next few years. We'll probably kind of come round towards about maybe after 40 minutes or 45 minutes. If you did have any burning questions, then there may be an opportunity for you also to raise some questions later on. So with that, I thought I'd start by just talking a little bit about me. As you know, I'm a fund manager. I've been a fund manager since 1985. In particular, I'm a fund manager at the smaller end of the markets, the smaller quoted end of the markets. Small quoted companies is an area where I've been investing in really since I started at Throgmorton Trust. I was about 18 years at Gartmore, and most recently with Miton Group, which is itself a quoted company. Miton Group is quite a small quoted company, but it invests in big and small companies, but particularly emphasis, the funds I run have an emphasis in the smaller end of the markets because we think there's greater opportunity at that end. And that's quite interesting, really, because what we've seen in the last 25 years is we've seen a long period when scale has been a main driver of markets. Globalization was clearly a big driver, and in many cases, a lot of institutions felt that small companies, small quoted companies, were largely outside of the globalization trend. And we've seen investors moving away from investing in the smallest companies in the last 25 years. But I think that's become worse probably in the last 5 years, with mainstream indices becoming even more dominant in terms of the way that investors allocate their capital, and with a move towards indexation, which by implication favors big over small. I think the same trend is also evident in the exchange-traded funds, the ETFs. ETFs have grown to be several billion several $billion of assets under management over the last 5 and 10 years. And again, just like index funds, they might be just gold stocks or they might be just other forms of investment, but basically they are still dominated by the largest quoted companies in many cases. And again, it does emphasize that people have been moving away from investing in smallness in the last 25 years. And I think structured products also give the illusion that you can control risks without necessarily getting invested in direct individual companies. And again, it means less direct investment in individual companies. And I think that altogether has been coming with the problems of the 2008 and the sort of extraordinary QE we've had since then, in a period really where productivity has dropped away. And that's a big issue because all wealth is ultimately generated by us becoming more productive. And productivity has really disappeared in terms of growth in productivity in the last 5 years. So I think there's a big opportunity for us to change people's minds. That's what I'm doing at Miton, trying to bring more people into small companies. But I think we've also got to look at the wider objectives. It's not just about making money for our clients. Of course we need to make money for clients as fund managers, but we've got to do it in an environment, a political background, which is supportive of that. And in a way, I think one of the features of the financial world is perhaps we haven't been sufficiently attentive to being socially useful. And what I mean by that isn't just that we've got to do lots of mushy stuff, but what I really mean is that we've got to make sure that those voters who don't have savings want a business-friendly environment. And I think hopefully this morning we're going to be talking about some of those issues. With that, I'm very happy to hand on to the rest of my panel. Joe.
Thank you. I'm Joe Twyman, Head of Political and Social Research at YouGov for Europe, the Middle East and Africa. And as some of you may be aware, I was one of the pollsters who predicted repeatedly during the election campaign that we were headed for a hung parliament. There's no getting away from it. We did get that bit of the polling incorrect, along with all other pollsters. Please send your abuse to @JoeTwyman on Twitter. Many people have, but what is clear in the aftermath of the election is that the world has changed. The political environment that we're talking about today has clearly changed substantially. We have a Conservative majority for the first time since 1992. And although it is a majority, it remains a small majority, and it's perhaps worth keeping that in mind in light of the euphoria that many politicians, indeed perhaps some of our panellists, share at the moment. The last thing the Conservatives wanted was to be beholden to 5 or 6 UKIP MPs in order to maintain a majority. In a sense, they still are. It just so happens that those UKIP MPs are under the Conservative banner. But another key feature of the election and the changing political environment was the rise of anti-politics. And although this didn't measure so much in terms of seats, In England, it was very clear in Scotland. So the absolute domination of the SNP in Scotland was a key feature. The 4 million votes almost for UKIP in England and Wales and a couple in Scotland, although it didn't resonate in terms of seats, was important. Also nearly 1 million votes for the Greens, and of course the collapse of the Lib Dems down to only 8 seats. These are all features of this drive towards anti-politics that we're seeing in Britain and we're seeing across Europe, where these parties are being very effective at mopping up support from the dissatisfied, the distrusting, the disapproving, people who feel that they have been left behind, and in essence people who feel that their pork should not always be pulled and that their caramel should not always be salted. These are people who are dissatisfied with politicians, with political parties and with political institutions in general. And what that means across Europe, I think, is going to be particularly important during this period of potentially of instability with parties like Syriza in Greece and also similar anti-austerity parties in Portugal, Italy and Spain, and what that means for the future of the European Union. And then, of course, we have the big issue over the next Parliament, that of a European referendum in this country. Whether it's in 2016 or 2017, even the date is a point of some confusion and instability. But the implications for that are huge, and we can perhaps discuss where I think that's going in more detail later. With regards specifically to small business, we saw during the election campaign that politicians are in favour of small businesses, much like they're in favour of working families, of hard-working people. They like wearing hard hats, and high visibility jackets are extremely important. No one is going to campaign against small businesses, but in terms of the actual party manifestos, the Conservative Party manifesto have very little in terms of specific policies for small businesses, but we do, of course, have the inevitable call for a reduction in red tape and efficiency savings and all that sort of thing. It's regularly promised, it's relatively hard to deliver on, and it doesn't happen to quite the degree that's ever promised. We'll have to see whether this changes in the new political environment over the next Parliament.
Thank you, Joe. Kay.
Thank you, and indeed I am one of those euphoric Conservative members, but I'm a member of the European Parliament for Wales, and as a Conservative member there, we are not a rare beast. We are actually the official opposition in the Assembly government and the Assembly to the government, and we actually now, of course, have that majority, all-important majority in Westminster, which allows the role of the member of European Parliament, probably for the first time in a very long time, to take some prominence amongst my members of Parliament at Westminster, where they're suddenly realising that their colleagues who are entrenched in Brussels for most of the time have got a role in the reform and renegotiation package that needs to be completed before we go to the general population to actually put a referendum on whether or not we stay within the EU within the next 2 years. And of course the date in the bill that will be published will actually be the 31st of December 2017, which will be the latest point at which that referendum can be held. So in terms of uncertainty for businesses, hopefully at least that date is the final date. Anything before that, of course, is still possible. And I'm one of those who firmly believes that it should be as early as possible. I believe that we can actually get the reform and renegotiation that we need at a pace. And therefore, my personal preference would be that I have a very important Welsh Assembly election next May. Scotland have a parliamentary election up in their region, and Northern Ireland also have very important Assembly elections, not least of which you also have Assembly elections here and the Mayoral Elections here in London next year. So if we were to have it on the same day, I suspect it would actually benefit everybody to get it out of the way, to get the uncertainty through, and to actually get a positive outcome. And yes, I am a Conservative, and I am saying a positive outcome. Ultimately, for me, I'm in the middle of the reform process in Brussels right now. There was a question asked a short while ago by the European Commission of SMEs throughout Europe as to what did they want to see happen in order to make Europe work for them. And the one key thing that came back was to cut red tape. And you may actually mock the fact that cutting red tape is something that people say, but it's something that businesses have actually told the Commission. It's something businesses have been telling politicians repeatedly over a period of time. And actually the UK government, the coalition government as it was in the last 5 years, took that message on board and put in place a one-in, one-out piece of regulation where for every regulation they introduced, they had to remove one from the statute book. And in fact, they felt that wasn't successful enough and ended up with one-in, two-out to try and actually remove some of those unwanted pieces of legislation from the statute book. Europe has actually followed suit, and the new Commission, as of last autumn, has introduced exactly the same system. And not only are they going for a one-in, one-out, they are going through the existing legislation that is no longer needed or is outmoded and outdated and trying to take it off the table. Ultimately, cutting red tape and bureaucracy is at the heart of the reform agenda. But you may hear in the UK, this is a UK reform agenda. We're the only ones who want it. It's not true. Europe as a whole wants this reform agenda and are actually starting to deliver it. Whereas the EU legislation typically would have 130 pieces of legislation on the go at any one time, they have cut that already to 23. And Frans Timmermans, the first Vice President of the Commission, has stated he wants to actually go further and potentially halve that number at any one time and potentially through a lifetime of a mandate. So we're talking about doing less and doing it better. And ultimately, I'm not sure there's anybody in this room who would actually disapprove of that particular mission. So this is all about cutting red tape. It's about renegotiation too. And what do we mean by renegotiation? We mean about creating a system that actually gives some fairness within the legal system. So how do you protect those who are not ever going to be part of the Eurozone from any particular coalescing that might happen amongst those particular countries that are part of a single currency? There are ways in which we can find mechanisms to protect those who are non-Eurozone versus the Eurozone. And if we find those mechanisms and actually have consensus amongst other countries, then we are going to have a renegotiated Europe, not just in fairness for the UK, but for all member states. And I think ultimately the key here is reform doesn't benefit the UK in isolation, it's for the entirety of the 28 member states and those who are part of the extended EEA family. And ultimately, if we get reform and renegotiation, we will have the referendum, and you will find a government in the majority will actually be campaigning to stay in. Because we do ultimately see the single market as a huge prize. We appreciate that the tariff-free Europe is incredibly important, and access to over 520 million customers is incredibly beneficial. Not going so far as saying if we conclude free trade association agreements with various other countries that the EU is able to do on preferential terms to single countries, we then have access potentially to the US. We have already access to South Korea. We're already negotiating the Canadian and the Chinese free trade agreements at an EU level. All of these markets have preferential tariffs for our businesses, and that ultimately should be what the EU is about. It should be about freeing up trade opportunities for our businesses, particularly our SMEs, throughout Europe, so that they can trade with the rest of the world on preferential terms. I believe we will have a positive outcome to that referendum, and it needs to happen sooner rather than later. So reform, yes. Renegotiation, absolutely. But ultimately, I think we need a new mandate to engage with Europe. When the UK engages in the process, we get what we want. We shape the legislation, and we actually need a government in Westminster able to have that new mandate and to be reinvigorated to go out there and shape the EU in the form that we want it that benefits our businesses.
Thank you, Kay. Simon.
Thank you, Gervais. I'm not Ken Clarke, and when Tim asked me to step in for the great man, I thought, how do I best prepare for this? So I went to Ronnie Scott's last night and smoked a big cigar. But I am actually delighted to be on this panel, I run AFME, the trade association, the trade group, which represents essentially Europe's largest banks, mainly investment banks, the sell side. So my perspective on this is very much from the perspective of the, as I say, from the banking community, the European banking community. I mean, just on the theme of the session, I don't think anyone would doubt there is a very close connection between politics and business sentiment, just seeing the kind of what happened to some of the indicators in the run-up to the election, housing prices, what was happening in the markets. There's a pretty clear link, clearly, between what people want, which is political certainty, and that's what we have, and how people feel about the economic outlook. I mean, just on the election, the only other comment I'd make about the outcome is that it's interesting in terms of the continuity. I mean, the three great offices of state have not changed, and that's quite rare post an election, particularly where there's a good working majority. I think that there are some really good people coming into government with excellent business credentials. Greg Hands, who was a former derivatives trader way back in the Treasury. Harriet Baldwin as the City Minister, deep experience in the asset management world. Jim O'Neill, soon to be Lord O'Neill, as Commercial Secretary, looking at infrastructure and driving the Northern Powerhouse Initiative, which I think is a really important part of this government's programme. And of course, Sajid Javid, a former banker himself, right at the heart of biz. And just to say something right up front about our members' sort of perspective on the in-tray of certainly the Treasury Ministers, and my colleague Richard Middleton, who runs our tax team, is here. I mean, the issue of the bank levy is a really significant concern for our members, and there is a budget coming down the track. What we'd like to see on the bank levy, which has significantly increased 8 or 9 times in the last few years, is at least a roadmap as to where that's going, and I think it's one of our kind of immediate political asks of this government. I mean, obviously, as Joe very charmingly said, forecasting is a fallible art, but I do think that it's made even more difficult in current circumstances because of what we've just been talking about, the UK's relationship with Europe. Many of the policies that AFME is involved in are European policies, and they're about growth, and they're about jobs in Europe. As Kay knows, we aim to be deeply engaged in European economic and financial policy making, but from a constructive engagement point of view. One of the things we've done is we've produced a big report called Bridging the Growth Gap with the Boston Consulting Group that looks at the differences between the US and the EU in terms of funding businesses at different levels. Not the big businesses, because they never really have the problems of the small and growing businesses. And it's reconfirming what we all know, essentially, that in the US, if you're a growing business, there are so many different ways that you can access finance. And the over-reliance on bank lending in Europe is a huge structural challenge. And obviously it's not going to change overnight, but I think there's a huge requirement for policymakers and others to find ways of ensuring that over-reliance on bank lending is adjusted. We can't obviously import, and it wouldn't be appropriate anyway, kind of a US model, but I think learning from other markets and learning how we can develop other ways of allowing growing companies to access finance is really important. We're very supportive, particularly in respect to that, of the Capital Markets Union Initiative. I mean, some people call it a black empty box, but I think actually there's something really quite powerful there. I think bringing together the capital markets in 28 member states, led, I have to say, by London as the leading financial centre, is really quite exciting. And I think that Jonathan Hill, has actually pragmatically begun the process of putting together quite an interesting programme. We'll see where that comes, whether it's some adjustments. I certainly think what it won't be, and what we hope it won't be, is more regulation. To Kay's point, I think enough regulation, Ed. Let's get it embedded. But I think in terms of, it shouldn't be about another level of supervision. It should be about different ways of ensuring that becomes a reality. Finally, on the UK and Europe, as Kay said, we know now the timetable. I completely agree. I think from a markets and AFME point of view, an earlier referendum would be by far the best outcome. There are some imponderables, obviously the bottom lines for this government in terms of what they want, what sort of deal they want to do, the extent to which the rest of the EU will be prepared to compromise, and already there are different views coming out about that. We expect many of our members, AFME members, to be concerned about what would happen in the event of a Brexit to passporting, for instance. It would be a huge, huge structural problem for our members if passporting was no longer a possibility. So AFME absolutely supports the UK's continued membership of the EU, and we do so on the basis that integrated capital markets are good for Europe as a whole. We don't support a couple of policies in particular which we think fly completely in the face of an integrated capital markets. One is our old friend, the financial transaction tax, which Lazarus-like refuses to die. And the second one is bank structural reform, which, depending how you look at it, potentially could go even further than Vickers in the UK. So finally, the EU obviously needs vigorous financial markets to deliver the economic growth and jobs that, frankly, the politicians need to deliver. Without the UK, the EU risks being deprived of its main financial markets engine, and I think actually would really cut across the completion of the Capital Markets Union. So finally, we as AFME believe that there needs to be a positive, broadly based campaign that enables people who take the view that the UK should stay in Europe to be part of that. And I think a fact-based campaign, a positive fact-based campaign now, is really important, and to enable businesses that believe that's the right outcome to be involved in that without being drawn into the politics of it. So that, I think, is a really important next step.
Thank you very much, Simon. Okay, if we now move on to sort of discussing some of those points, I mean, one of the things which you brought up, Simon, which I thought might ask Kay, is that actually if we have a quicker EU referendum, whether actually there's anything meaningful which will actually change prior to that vote. You know, are we in a way, by bringing if we were to accelerate the programme, would we ultimately mean that we couldn't really deliver to some of those expectations, that there would be a fundamental change in the agenda between ourselves and the EU?
I think the problem with that is assuming that there is no change happening at the moment. It is not a sudden moment things are going to happen. It's happening already. Yeah. If the UK media happened to have looked last autumn when the new commission was put in place, the biggest ask I had 2 years ago when I was asked what would be my biggest reform was a commission that actually was going to be structured more like an executive board of a company. Because ultimately you want somebody in control, and you want a management who are actually controlling what the line managers are proposing, so you have some gatekeeper effects within it, rather than 27 competing commissioners who measure their output in 5 years by how much legislation they'd got through the system. So I mean, it became a bit of a sausage machine, and ultimately it was a real competitive environment and the worst possible outcome for everybody. What they did last autumn, when Juncker actually formed his new commission, was to put in place clusters of commissioners working together in themes, and that they had to actually all agree that a piece of legislation was necessary to be done at an EU level rather than national, had to demonstrate it with evidence, and then had to take it up to the vice presidents. Vice presidents had to approve it, had to go to the senior vice president, who then proposed it to the commission president himself. That is much more like a company's hierarchy, where you've got checks and balances all the way up, and you have impact assessments all the way up. That actually ultimately is why we've gone from 130 pieces of legislation immediately to 23. And most of those 23, by the way, were hangover from the last mandate, so they weren't even new ones. Yeah. We've had at single hand, I can count the number of new ones. So ultimately, that massive reform, and it's a huge change in culture, change in the way the institutions are being run and driven, completely unreported in the UK, gone completely unnoticed, but it does mean that we've already started that reform agenda. They have the new Impact Assessment Centre, which is actually being formed right now and recruited by independent experts to do proper cost-benefit analysis. All of these things have happened. They've all been instigated. So the reform's already on its way, but it's not our reform, it's everyone's reform. And ultimately, it's better that we actually completely transform the institutions themselves for the 28, rather than try and negotiate special exemptions for the UK. Because exemptions only work for small things, they don't work for big things. Yeah. And actually, ultimately, it's better that we take everybody along with us. If I actually listed off some of the reforms, the growth agenda that Juncker put into his plan effectively takes the entire cutting red tape manifesto that Cameron presented to the European Council back in 2011. It takes the entirety of his manifesto and absorbs it within the Juncker plan. So all of these things are actually driven by the UK, they've been adopted by Europe, and now we're actually having the reform agenda we wanted. Ultimately, these things really do need to start gaining momentum. We need to see the delivery of them, but they're there, they're happening. So the renegotiation is the issue for me here, because the reform agenda's got the momentum. The renegotiation is about now establishing within the parameters of future treaties how you ensure fairness going forwards. How do you ensure fairness in access to welfare? How do you ensure access to those who actually want to work, but actually not disadvantage those in the member state that that the work is being supplied. But you also need to actually ensure there's fairness between the Eurozone ins and the Eurozone outs. And these are going to be big things for future treaty changes. And ultimately, there are going to be other circumstances in the background, well, they're not even in the background, they're in the foreground. So we talk about a Brexit today, but the Grexit is what we're talking about in Brussels right now. What happens to Greece? How do we deal with the Greek situation? And does that involve a treaty change in order to actually get new solutions for Greece to actually either stay or to leave the Eurozone? And ultimately, they will involve treaty changes. So we need to, over a period of years, work out how we get legal certainty for the ins and the outs so that we actually have a fair single market going forwards. And these are things that can be done quickly because there's a will. And where there is a political will across the member states, then ultimately I think we're going to see it happen.
Thank you. Joe, I mean, I think it'd be quite interesting to hear your perspective on it, partly from the polls. If we have an early poll, will it be good or bad in terms of the vote? And particularly if there isn't substantive change coming through with the vote, will that affect the overall result?
Well, Kay has very eloquently and very well highlighted the major problem that the pro-European politicians have when it comes to the EU referendum. And that is that there are lots of good things happening, there are lots of reforms taking place, there is a lot of movement being made, and nobody cares. Nobody cares at all. Nobody gives a flying what's it about many of these things at a national level. And you're absolutely right in response to the question that I know you're thinking now. Yes, they should care, because it is important, because it does matter, because it does have an impact. But we're not dealing with reality here, we're dealing with people's perceptions. And I may say from a personal point of view, sadly, when it comes to people's views of a number of different things, but specifically Europe in this case, people don't have a very well-formed idea, and they also don't have much interest in the minutiae. Instead, they're interested in the grand narratives. The grand narratives, these stories that we tell ourselves and each other about Europe. And what are those stories? Well, no one really knows what it's about anymore. The grand narratives of peace, of free trade, etc. Yes, they're still there, but it's perceived as having lost its way slightly. But also there's a recognition that reform needs to take place, but then there's no real agreement on how reform should take place. And then when you ask people, what's the best thing? Well, let me turn around. You ask people, what's the worst thing about being a member of the European Union? And definitely in the top, around the top of the list, people, the British public says it's freedom of movement. It's just wrong that people can come here and they can take our jobs, etc., etc. And then when you say, well, what's the best thing about the membership of the European Union? And people say, it's freedom of movement. It's really great that I can go and work anywhere. Now, that's not incorrect data. That's cognitive dissonance, which unfortunately is not uncommon in British public opinion, as I now so painfully know.
Yeah.
And so if a referendum is to be won, and actually I think it probably will be, you have to change the perception that people have. People are crying out for reform. If you ask people on the simple in-out question, then at the moment, slightly more people say they want to stay in than want to stay out. But if you ask the more detailed question about what do you actually want, only about a quarter of people want to leave entirely. A small number of people want things to stay as they are, but the vast majority want some form of reform. And so if you can change the perception that reform has, and make people perceive that reform has taken place, then you shouldn't have so much problem winning a referendum. The question is, over the next year, 2 years, can the government sufficiently change people's minds and make them think the reform that's good for them has indeed taken place? Or will it still be the kind of things that sadly is not picked up by the newspapers?
Simon, I mean, clearly the banking side of things, you've already said you're very much in favour. Are there factors about the current agenda which you feel the banking has a particular focus on this area?
Well, I think there'll be some discussions, I'm sure, in the reforms that are being debated that will be directly relevant to our sector. But I mean, I think it's much more. I mean, I was very interested in Joe's comments about kind of getting the message. I think this campaign, as we're talking about it, has to have very few men in suits. It has to have people who are actually can speak about their experience of the EU from a completely different perspective. I think this will be a successful campaign if it has a completely different feel to it. I think one of the big lessons of politics in the last 30 years is people don't listen to big, bold comments about institutional change or reform. They want to know what it means to them in their day-to-day life. So I think that's a really important. I think the banking community can explain why it's really important. It's such a big market and why passporting is important. But the reality is people will listen to other people who are closer to it. The other thing I just want to say, which is perhaps a slightly nerdish point, but I'm going to say it, is that in 1975, which was the last referendum, just in timing, that was only a year after the election. And if you think about it, if they'd waited 2 years, you would have been in the grip of a financial crisis, the famous Jim Callahan, what crisis in 76. The honeymoon would have been over. Who knows whether in 1976 the referendum would have been won as comfortably as it was in 75. So I really think, and look at Charles de Gaulle in France when he called one referendum too many. I think referendums are a risk.
Yep.
You've got to get it right in terms of the timing. I do think, as Kay said, I think getting it early and getting it in when people again don't feel that it's another burden, but it kind of fits into other elections, has got to be the right thing to do.
Excellent. I mean, in terms of the engagement which the corporate world can do, particularly smaller quoted companies, an awful lot of them represented here today, what is there, do you think, Kay, which they can actually do which will make a difference to the debate and helping perhaps the pro-union?
Well, I think Simon is right here. This is not about men in grey suits, and it shouldn't be about any female or male politicians, because ultimately this isn't about the political elite. This is about the people who actually benefit from access to the single market. And actually, ultimately, I would imagine it's most of you in this room that actually envisage that you can access those customers across the 27 other countries as easily as you can your own country's constituent customers. So this is about actually having people who benefit and understand the tariff-free trading environment and understand the benefits to them and therefore how many jobs they create and what impact it has upon their employees, to actually be able to talk it through. And I think this is going to have to come from the grassroots. Genuinely, this has got to stop being the pub conversation about, somebody else is taking my job. And when you actually talk to people, it's the number one issue for them. And they say, well, how many people do you know that actually couldn't get employment in your company because you employed migrant workers from somewhere else in Europe? And almost they would say, well, no, it doesn't happen in my company, but I'm told it happens. But it's always third hand, it's never individuals. And so I think the perception is the really important thing here. The only way we're going to change that perception is by business leaders actually having these discussions and talking about the benefits of what they see as being the single market and seeing the EU. And the real issues for us, cutting that red tape is critical. The EU cannot just say it, they have to do it. And I would hope that in the next few months, leading up to next May, we will see a major change in the amount of legislation that affects small companies. And if at all possible, that they would be completely exempt as small entities under 50 employees from any Brussels-led initiatives. They should only be subject to national law. Ultimately, the problem for me, though, is that when you look at the way the UK implements directives, many of them have the opportunity for them to exclude SMEs entirely from their mandate. They choose not to. And they've chosen not to through successive UK governments. They've always included more and more companies in their net, even though they had the ability to exclude them. Now, that isn't Brussels' fault, that is the UK government's fault for not implementing directives in the least harmful way that they could to business. So I think we do have to be careful as to where the blame lies. Politicians are very good at blaming someone else when they really wanted to introduce it themselves. And so when you have the balance of competence review that happened over the last couple of years, they looked at every aspect of legislation from Brussels. Every department in government looked at what legislation they would remove from the statute book if they actually came away from Europe. And ultimately, there were very few pieces of law that we would remove from our statute book if we left. We actually think it's beneficial. And so if that is the feeling of the consultations, you have to be aware the legislation will come from somewhere. And are you really convinced that Westminster will do a better job than Brussels?
Quite a question. I mean, Joe, you mentioned a little bit about the fact that a lot of Eurosceptics are in the Conservative Party, and that we've got a background perhaps where some of the political agendas are beginning to change over Europe, not just Brexit, but of course the Spanish elections, perhaps the Italian elections. Do you think that's going to begin to change the whole mood music of the Euro debate?
Yes, I think it could. I think a crucial point would arise if Greece were to leave, and how it then performed outside the European Union, and I think that would potentially change people's perceptions. To see Greece flourish, when able to go on its own, would have an impact, as indeed would a Greece that collapses and drops into whatever anarchy or disarray. But I think ultimately it comes down to changes more in sort of France and Germany, where we have big elections coming up, because a lot of the objections that people have to the European Union in this country are based on the concept of fairness. That's what it comes down to. The broad story that they tell themselves is that EU membership is not fair for us, and it's not fair for them as individuals. And so I think that actually a relatively small number of key changes would need to be made in order to change that perception. And a lot of those don't require treaty change. For instance, some sort of reform of benefits for immigrants to this country from the EU. And it doesn't need to be cancelling of them at all, or restrictions, but some form of reform, some mode of reform there, I think would change people's perceptions, because people actually, when you look at the results on this, people aren't in the main objecting to people coming here and working, people coming here and filling jobs where we have shortages and high-skilled workers coming here. They object to people coming here and claiming benefits. They object to people coming here and being perceived to jump the queue, because these are the stories that they hear. And so if you can change perceptions there, if you can change fairness, then rather than focusing on getting politicians to focus on specific details, if you can get, for instance, small businesses to talk about change in fairness, then that can be a great boost for the pro-EU position.
Interesting. Sorry, Simon. I was going to talk a little bit. You say something, and I'll come on with a further question. Yeah.
For me or for?
No, for Simon. Yeah.
Oh, well, I was always going to say is I just think it's very interesting, this kind of populist movement around Europe. It's the same basic constituency. It's the kind of the left behind. It's the people in each country who feel that whether it's economically or politically, they're kind of left behind by the system. I think this is again a really important reason why the promoting the case for the UK staying in the EU doesn't look as though it's coming from quote unquote an elite, because that's completely wrong. I think, if you analyse the UKIP vote, a lot of those people are actually people who genuinely think that, the society, the economy has moved on beyond them, and it's reconnecting that group in European countries is incredibly important.
I was going to ask you, we're sitting here obviously with a QCA event. To what degree you think that the actual, the institution of the QCA, or indeed other groups like the QCA, can really affect the changes which are needed through this process?
Well, I would say this, wouldn't I? I'm a great believer in the role and relevance of trade groups. I think the QCA is very lucky to be led so well by Tim, and I think having good leadership is incredibly important for any trade group. And I also think it's really interesting that there are some issues that individual companies don't particularly want to engage in directly, because it either is too sensitive or they have concerns about it. I think trade groups can be quite helpful, in fact very helpful, when they speak on behalf of an industry, as long as they can do it credibly. For people like Kay, who is inundated with requests for meetings from companies and trade groups, I hope that part of the effectiveness of a trade group is to be able to genuinely represent views without then Kay having to speak to 30 other people. But I do think, which is why it's great to see so many people today, a trade group is at its best when it has engaged members. I think absolutely, when you sit down in front of a policymaker and that policymaker knows that your members are engaged and you're genuinely speaking for them, that makes a huge difference, as opposed to kind of going through the motions. So more power to the elbow of the QCA.
Would you like to say anything further on that, Kay?
No, I would, and in particular, I mean, we have to remember 99% of the companies in Europe are SMEs, so are under 250 employees. So the vast majority of the legislation needs to actually benefit those companies rather than hold them back. And ultimately, that realization is what is now driving our reform and should have always been at the heart of everything that we did. But it's been a little late, but it now is there at the heart of the agenda of the growth and jobs as defined by Juncker. Ultimately, we now need to actually look at the forward-looking programs, like the Capital Markets Union that was just referred to, and find ways of actually facilitating capital movement to allow companies to grow. And this is about lowering barriers rather than more legislation and more supervision. It's about where are the barriers at the moment, how can we make it easier for a company anywhere in Europe to get access to investor capital anywhere in Europe. And that flow is really important.
Yeah.
Finding instruments that will work cross-border will be really important. And we've got to do it, and we've got to do it urgently. And I think the proof of the pudding will be the delivery of things like the CMU. We need to deliver for SMEs. We have to have a more active capital base rather than a bank loan lending scheme that Europe so heavily relies upon. And we have to find ways of listening to companies more effectively. And that means that you know, the QCA is really, really important. Because when I was trying to establish an SME growth market within a big piece of legislation, it was in danger of getting lost. But voices like the QCA and individuals coming forwards and giving their experiences of being a listed company in Europe were critically important. Many of them are actually UK-based rather than elsewhere. Some of the other markets across Europe are nowhere near as advanced in terms of using capital markets, and even we're not advanced in terms of other markets around the world. But you know, their voices are really important to give examples of what's really helpful and also examples of what is not helpful, because both sides of that equation are really important when you're drafting any form of legislation to facilitate capital moving to the right place. And I do think that trade organisations play a really important role, but actually ultimately individual stories are critical to us too. And if it wasn't for my engagement with the UK CBI at the early stages of derivatives legislation 5 years ago, we wouldn't have had a non-bank financial exemption. But because I could bring stories, individual examples, it actually changes the whole focus for politicians across the spectrum. And it's really important to me to get those stories through. So my door's always open, both to individual companies, but also to, obviously, the trade associations. If you can speak with one voice, it does save me 30 or 40 meetings. But actually, ultimately, if I need to do the 30 or 40, I will do them.
Great. We've done a lot on the EU. I was wondering perhaps... Joe, if we can talk a little bit about the mayoral elections and whether that makes any significant difference, whether that's going to change the perception or the whole kind of sort of mood music around the London and the wider area.
The position of Mayor of London is an interesting one. Yes, you obviously have some powers, but essentially your main role is as a figurehead, and Boris Johnson has done an extremely good job of basically coming down on no one side on opposition throughout his time as mayor, but at the same time attracting approval ratings of over 50% from supporters of every party, which is quite unheard of in British politics, although sometimes it does happen regionally. I think the next election in 2016 will be interesting, because I imagine that we will see a change again, as these things so far have alternated. I imagine we will see Labour putting on a much stronger fight than it did last time. And indeed, to my mind, one of the great assets that Boris had was that he overperformed compared to the Conservatives. I think if anyone else had been their candidate last time, Labour would have won. I think this time they're going to have a great struggle finding anyone close to him in terms of quality of candidate and also name recognition. I imagine that the Labour Party will choose Sadiq Khan, but it's not by no means guaranteed, and I think Tessa Jowl and perhaps even David Lammy are other options as well. But if they do choose him, I can't really see a Conservative candidate that will go up against him to win, given how the political landscape in London has moved towards Labour recently. But we do have the division within London between the inner boroughs and the outer boroughs, and how that plays out could still have an effect. It's certainly going to be very interesting.
Brilliant. I was wondering at this stage whether we should open it up if there are any questions. I've got further questions here, but if you've got some interesting questions, please do raise your hand. I've got one straight away here.
My name is Don Elgie, and I'm chairman of Crossroads, which is an ad tech group. In fact, a question for Joe, because previously I was the CEO of Creston, which within it has ICM, one of your competitors. And bearing in mind how wrong the polling industry got the election, I'm wondering what your views are to put things right, because as things stand at the moment, it was a complete false dawn, wasn't it? And indeed, the polling industry has formed because it got it wrong with the Scottish referendum, where the don't knows did know, they just weren't telling you.
Thank you for that question. It is indeed a pleasure to be here. I would say a couple of things in response to that. Yes, polling does have form. 1970, 1992, and now 2015. So it's roughly every 22, 23 years that we get a general election wrong. So maybe we should just factor that into the predictions. Where we didn't get it wrong is the Scottish referendum. The Scottish referendum polling was largely accurate within margin of error in terms of the final result. And so, yes, there was movement along the way, as indeed you would expect in a referendum of that type, and we saw exactly the same thing in Quebec in the 1990s. And so I would say that we were right on the Scottish referendum in the same way that we were right on the European elections last year, where YouGov at least got the results within 1% of the actual outcome. But we didn't get the share of Labour and Conservative right at this election. We did, however, get the share of the Lib Dems, we did get the share of the SNP, we did get the share of UKIP, broadly correct, but it's not about that, and I know it. So yes, we at YouGov and every other pollster, whether it's telephone such as ICM or face-to-face or online as YouGov are, we all got that headline horse race wrong. Where do we go from here? Well, what we're not doing is immediately throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We are taking a detailed, constructive, and may I say, long look at where we are. We have the advantage at YouGov of over 500,000 panelists registered on our panel, and them having taken part in surveys in some cases for up to 15 years. So we have millions, literally millions of data points that we can look at. My sense is that this is there is no simple answer to this. It's not that we're going to turn around and say, oh, you know what, it was just that we didn't ask anyone in Wales, or it was that we didn't ask any men in London. It's not a simple error. Instead, I think it's more of a systemic problem, combining lots of smaller issues that come together to cause this difficulty. But as I say, we're in a privileged position to have an awful lot of data to look at it, and so I'm confident that in the same way that the polling industry did eventually come back after 1992, I think much faster this time around, because of the data available, we will be in a good position to return to the kind of accuracy that we're used to and indeed have enjoyed over the last 15 years.
Simon, what was your perspective on this issue?
Well, I'm just taking my AFME cap off, and I do think that the polls played a disproportionate role in the dynamic of the campaign. I just think that going forward, there's got to be a way of kind of taking the polling out of what the campaign is about, if that makes sense. I mean, you can't obviously stop, although some countries do, you can't stop polling during a campaign, but I do think there's a real lesson there for, what is the story of a campaign? It shouldn't be what is today's polls. So I think there's something around that. And the second point is I do think, and Joe will correct me if I'm wrong, I do think when it comes to referendum, polling is bound to be much more accurate because it's a binary decision. I think one of the challenges you had with the election is obviously the multifaceted nature of the options. I think, because actually you're right, I mean, the Scottish referendum result was predicted absolutely spot on, and I would be surprised, famous last words, if the polls around the referendum here would be significantly skewed, because it's a very different question you're asking people. There's no such thing as a shy voter in that sense.
Yeah.
That's just a personal view.
Okay.
Well, I have huge sympathy for Joe and his colleagues because I had a whole speech before my European election last year, planned at a party policy forum where I have my party members, and I had a whole speech where before my speech I was going to ask them, as things stand today, if you had a vote on in or out of the EU, how would you vote? And of course I was then going to give a whole speech based upon the outcome that they wanted out straight away, and then I was going to give a speech, and afterwards they were supposed to be doing some polling and they would tell me that they actually now thought that maybe they'd at least think about it. They had the same gadgets that you've got, those very little gadgets that nobody can see what you're doing. And it was amazing. My entire speech went out the window because overwhelmingly almost everybody in the room voted to stay in as it was. And these are my most cynical, skeptical, EU-phobic people, and yet they actually all voted to stay in. And so ultimately, I think that when people go in a ballot box, they go in private, they already know the things that drive them, but they will not necessarily tell even their closest loved ones what they are going to do. And I think that's a good thing. I know it's not good for pollsters, but I think it's a good thing that people actually feel confident to do what they think is right in the ballot box, in the privacy of their ballot box. And I wouldn't expect everybody to tell the truth when they're actually asked on the street, because my party members certainly didn't tell their other half sitting next to them, because all afternoon everybody spent the time saying, how did you vote? You must have voted. Oh my God. And it was one of those strange afternoons.
Brilliant. Any further questions? One over here.
Thank you, Dick Steele from Port Marion. I have absolutely no faith in the desire of any politician to reduce red tape. I think you might as well ask a parent to reduce the rules in the house. They are psychologically badly adapted to it. And if we go back to the main subject here, facilitating or hindering growth, politics should provide the education for the population, the security for the population, the rule of law, the healthcare for the nation, and then get the hell out of it. And if I look back to the previous administration, on almost day one, they removed the Home Information Pack, which Yvette Cooper had brought in at great expense, and nobody noticed it passing, and it was brilliant. And I struggle to find of anything else that they did, including the Office for Tax Simplification. Very little has come out of that. So I am very dubious that we will get any reduction in red tape. The second point I wanted to make is, as it seems to be known that the people will vote to stay in Europe, why are we going to have a referendum?
I mean, for me, it's ultimately about having a mandate. I think there are successive governments, no matter what colour they've been, and I would say for at least the last 20 years, have actually not felt that they have got a mandate to be fully supportive of the EU project as it now is, in terms of the single market and its role in the global competitive world. And nobody feels that they can drive forwards because they're scared of what they might find back home from their electorate or from their party members, from their funders. And ultimately, nobody has had that confidence. I think what this referendum does is give a generation an opportunity to reaffirm, if that is the case, because obviously it is an in-out and there is a massive risk to a referendum. But actually, if it does reaffirm it, it gives the Prime Minister of this government and any future government a very strong mandate to engage and make sure that those reforms are driven through and make sure that we actually have an EU fit for purpose into the next century and beyond.
Joe, your perspective on that?
I think that's very laudable. I think there's also an additional dimension to it. I think the reason that the referendum was promised was because it was a political decision. It was a political decision to, David Cameron hoped, neutralise UKIP, to bring some UKIP supporters back into the fold come the general election, and to that extent, I think in the marginal seats it was certainly successful to a degree, and also to placate backbench discord within the Conservative Party. But there is, and I quite agree with Kay here, there is the fact that a now increasingly large number of people have never had a chance to offer an opinion on Europe, and indeed even those people who were able to offer an opinion in 1975, which I'm assuming none of us on this panel were able to do, and indeed some of us were not even born for, but there is a generation who were not able to give an opinion, and even among those who were, they many of them believe that they did not give an opinion on the current form of the European Union. And so, yes, it does provide a mandate for that.
Actually, I saw Guy Sears nodding over there, so I'm assuming Guy voted in 75. But I do think that it is a risk. I think the 1975 referendum campaign split the Labour Party for a generation because it led to the direct creation of the SDP, and then the Labour Party was out of power until 1997. So there's an inherent risk in a fissure like that emerging this time around as well. I think that's just a fact. I do think, I completely agree with what Kay said about the mandate. I also believe that the franchise should be extended. I've got a 15-year-old teenage son. I think it would be completely right that he, either at 15, 16, 17, gets an opportunity to vote, because I think it's such a big generational thing. But that's another related matter. But I think it's the right thing to do, but I think there is a domestic political risk that's very difficult to manage, actually, with the referendum. And that's the risk.
I was going to say, actually, what's interesting about the electoral reform issue, which could have come out of the box now after the last election, is that because we had a referendum recently, I think that's going to stay strictly off the agenda, probably politically, for the next few years for that reason.
But can I just say that one of the big things about European legislation is that it's co-decision. So the European Parliament, so those European elections that 70% of the population ignore because we only have a 30% voter turnout. So that election is proportional representation. We have 72 British MEPs, of which 20 of them are UKIP. 20 of them do no work. 20 of them do not represent the UK's voice in legislation. Yeah. So the rest of us have to do far more work in order to try and actually compensate for it. And I genuinely hope that actually, if nothing else, this referendum will allow the facts to get out there, make people realise that actually those elections are important and have an effect on people's, employment. They have an effect on people's ability to start businesses and to actually flourish. And hopefully in the next European elections, people will think a little more carefully as to whether they want somebody to actually go there and do nothing but get paid all of their salary for it, or whether they want people to go and represent their views.
Great. Another question, this one at the front. Yes.
Thanks. My name's Edward Craft. I'm a lawyer at Wedlake Bell. As a lawyer, I'm firstly going to declare that treaties are very boring documents, and I can almost guarantee that most people haven't read them. What is absolutely the case is that I've read more of the Lisbon Treaty than everybody in the media, it seems, because they always forget the ever closer union is about the peoples, not the structures, etc. However, the concern I have is that by going out to say, right, we're going to start to renegotiate these treaties, we're opening Pandora's box. And it's always viewed from the UK perspective. There were problems with Maastricht, with Nice, with Lisbon. As soon as we say, if we manage to renegotiate a treaty, this then needs to be put to other member states' referendums. They may then reject the treaty. Where would that leave the UK in Europe as a result?
Can we take another couple of questions and then we can just sort of make sure there's one right at the back, and maybe we're taking one hand right at the back.
Richard Crump, I'm from Accountancy Age, Financial Director. I just wondered what the panel thinks about greater devolution in the UK, chiefly more power to regional sort of cities, Manchester, Birmingham, and what a movement in that direction means for the smaller cap market.
Thank you very much. One further, I think one over here.
John Hayward, Pressure Technologies. One of the things that strikes me as very evident, and Sir Wim Bischoff talks about continuity, is short-termism in politics, when a lot of our issues in the UK are actually long-term issues, things like energy policy, where we have a hub airport in the UK, and the sort of things, if you're a career politician, look into the next election, and your immediate electorate cause problems in the long term. When the lights start going off, who gets the blame?
Brilliant. Okay, well, there's three questions there. I think we're coming to our end, so we'll have just a few minutes left. So I was going to start with Joe. We've got this Pandora's box about treaties. We've got the devolution questions, and regionally in the UK, and short-termism in terms of politics. Do you want to sort of round that up with any final comments you might have?
To round up very quickly, I would say on referendum change, I agree. I think referendum change is extraordinarily difficult to achieve in Europe, and that's why I think that any negotiation, renegotiation and reform that takes place in order to win the referendum will not be based on treaty change, and instead will be within the existing confines of the legislation. On devolution, I think devolution could potentially be important, but politically it's actually incredibly difficult to put into place properly. You only have to look, admittedly, at the extreme example of the police and crime commissioners, and basically the democratic failing that experiment has been. The fact that elected mayors have been rejected by referendums in certain areas and then imposed separately. I think it's very difficult, a very difficult area to work out sensibly to gain the support of the public, but potentially things like the Northern Powerhouse could change that, and short-term politics versus long-term thinking. Yes, you're right.
Okay.
I think everybody's aware that treaty change is going to be an incredible Pandora's box, which is why it's not going to happen in an overt way. It will happen by addendums, it will happen in the way it's happened in the past, with additions being promised that when they actually, with protocols, when they actually then have a treaty change of another kind that's necessary, they will actually be added on. It's the way that Europe has worked over decades. It will continue to work that way because they try to avoid the democratic accountability of referenda in all these different countries. It is the project's way of dealing with things. One I thoroughly disapprove of. I think it should be upfront and delivered. But the average treaty change has taken 10 years to negotiate. Therefore, it's unlikely that it's going to happen anytime soon. So it will have to use these mechanisms. They will find a bunch of lawyers to tell them how to do it, and it will be done. In terms of devolution in the UK, I'm a Welsh MEP. I have devolved government. But when I go on the street, what is really interesting during the general election campaign, nobody knew that entire healthcare and education was actually run by a Welsh Labour government and not by Westminster Conservatives and Lib Dems. So ultimately, there is a lot of confusion over devolution amongst the populace. I think we have to get it right in those devolved regions that have already got devolved powers and make a greater understanding of what is local and who is accountable for it and hold them to account. Because ultimately, poor Michael Gove is hated in Wales, and yet he's never had a thing to do with Welsh education. Yeah. So, it does get to be a slight problem. But ultimately, I think you need to learn the lessons, but I have never understood why the English regions have stayed so silent so long. Because Wales gets a huge amount of autonomy on all of these big issues, and yet they vote on all the English health and education issues. Why? I have never understood why the English, as such a large part of the United Kingdom, have stayed so silent. So I think we need to find some way of actually making it fairer for the largest part of the United Kingdom and make sure that they have an equivalent voice and far more local democratic accountability too. But how you let the population know who's responsible, we haven't got it right yet elsewhere. So I'm wondering, long-term thinking, you are very, very right. And I'm one of those probably few politicians that believes there is huge value. Maybe I've been in Brussels too long. We do consensual politics. We work cross-party. I actually do believe that on long-term strategic issues, we should have cross-party thinking on these things. If you've got a 20-year project, you should have buy-in across political parties, and you should find a policy that suits the country as a whole with a long-term vision, and politicians are then beholden to deliver it, whoever's in power. And I do think that you should do that for energy policy without a shadow of doubt. It's too important to have a 5-year cycle, and more than that, I would go down to the National Health Service. I got incredibly irritated that the NHS was a political football. It shouldn't be. It's too important to people, and we should actually get away from this short-term view and actually take a much more strategic view. Our population's aging. We can't afford to actually play with it, and cross-party groups would actually really help that.
Thanks, Kay. Simon.
On treaty change, I completely agree with Kay. On the devolution, I think it's not for now, but I think the big issue of the UK is that this is a fantastic city, London, but it's disproportionately powerful in all sorts of ways compared to the rest of the UK. So I do think the Northern Powers idea, which is a very strong idea with yet, without any detail yet, should be driving this rather than kind of devolution of the local government powers per se. I mean, why not start HS2 as the Northern Powerhouse piece rather than going from south to north? I can't understand the logic for doing it that way around. And just on short-termism, I mean, do you know how many city ministers there have been in 5 years? Harriet Baldwin is the 5th city minister. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And that is not a point about, I mean, I think there were probably as many city ministers in the government before that. I do think ministerial roles should not be treated like merry-go-rounds. I know it's the reality of politics, but these are really important roles. It's great we have a permanent civil service, and you know, the Treasury team on the civil service front is the same as it was 10 years ago, pretty much. But you know, treating these ministerial roles with greater, I think you're quite right about the kind of Brussels approach, has got to be a fundamental kind of thing that's got to be looked at.
Well, thank you very much. I want you to really join me in thanking Jo Twyman, Head of Political and Social Research at YouGov for the EMEA region, Dr. Kay Swinburne, to give her full title, MEP, and of course Simon Lewis, thank you very much for coming in at the last moment, Chief Executive, Association for the Financial Markets in Europe. Can you join me in thanking them very much indeed?